So welcome everybody, good to be back. My mother actually graduated from William & Mary as a Phi Beta Kappa in 1960, and my roots actually go back to 1923 to 1930 when my great-great-uncle Henry Krebs was a faculty member here in the School of Education. So I've got long, deep connections and roots with William & Mary. I'm going to start out tonight by talking about AI and its impact on technology and innovation, but I wanted to start first with a quote from Socrates, who famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Philosophers still debate whether he said that before or after "I drank what?" But that's a different story. To channel my inner Socrates, I have a phrase that says, "The unrecorded talk is not worth giving." So tonight we'll be recording this, and this is important because I also have recorded pretty much every talk I've given since 2012. I've got over 3,000 videos on my YouTube channel, and I have a playlist about generative AI. So some things we will not have time to go into detail here, but I'm going to give you pointers to those links, and these slides will be available in PDF form after the talk. So what do I want you to come away with from this talk? Well, first and foremost, I want you to recognize that artificial intelligence is just one of a long series of disruptive technologies that have changed the world over literally thousands of years. We're also going to talk about why there are aspects of AI that make its disruption different from the disruptions that have swept the world heretofore. I also want to talk about why augmented intelligence is a more relevant and appropriate way to talk about this technology than merely artificial intelligence. I'm going to give you a few examples of how I have applied augmented intelligence in the courses that I have been teaching over the past several years. And finally, I want to help give everybody here an appreciation for why I believe William & Mary is well positioned to become preeminent in the area of human-centered augmented intelligence, which I call AI++. Those of you who are C++ programmers understand the joke there. That's a tall order, getting everybody to buy into the fact that we should be preeminent in human-centered augmented intelligence. I realize not everybody's going to agree with that. So I decided that I would draw upon my experiences that I learned here as a student over 40 years ago. Now, there's a wonderful poem by Samuel Butler called Life After Death, which really gives the context for the people I'm about to talk about. And the poem says, "Not on sad Stygian shore, nor clear sheen of far Elysian plain, shall we meet those among the dead whose pupils we have been. Yet we shall meet and part and meet again, where dead men meet, on the lips of living men." And so there are three people, two of whom have sadly passed on, one of whom is still alive, that I'd like to briefly introduce to you because the lessons that they taught me here as a student have guided my thinking throughout my career about almost everything, but especially about human-centered augmented intelligence. One of my first philosophy professors, in fact, my first philosophy professor was Professor Alan Fuchs, and he taught me about the importance of the justified true belief. It's not enough to have a belief. It's not enough to have a belief that's true. You need a justified true belief, which means you need reasons and reasoning and evidence. My sociology master's thesis advisor, the late Michael Faya, taught me the importance of open-minded skepticism. He was an empiricist, and he believed that you needed to be open-minded enough to listen and skeptical enough to try it out and see if it works or not. And then finally, my most important lesson was taught me by Professor Cobb, who was an expert in the game of Go. And he taught me about Zen Buddhism and the importance of transcending dualism, avoiding false dichotomies, either-or thinking, looking for synergy and synthesis wherever possible, really making the ampersand important before the ampersand was cool. He was also very famous for wearing sandals around the campus, no matter how cold it was, and he said, "We must learn to embrace the cold." Let's take a quick tour over the past 2,400 years. I was originally going to go back about the past 1,000 years, and then I thought, I'm a William & Mary graduate, I can go back to the classics. So we're going to start by talking about 360 BC as our beginning starting point, and then we'll work our way up to very recently. What's important to note as I go through this is the fact that all these technology innovations have been double-edged swords with respect to their impact, with respect to their ethics, and so on. So let's start back 360 BC, where Plato in the work Phaedrus said, "And so it is that you, by reason of your tender regard for the writing that is your offspring, have declared the very opposite of its true effect. If men learn this writing, it will implant forgetfulness in their souls. They will cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written, calling things to remembrance no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks." Now, what was he getting at? He was criticizing people who were into the innovation of writing. At one point, writing was an innovation because they were diminishing the importance of the epic poet who had memorized all 15,693 lines of the Iliad by Homer and could recite it verbatim. There's a lot of interesting things about his discourse here. First and foremost, he did actually appreciate the fact that writing was a way to collect and share ideas. In fact, if it hadn't been for writing, we would think about the work of Socrates and Plato about as much as we think about the written works of Ramses II. Not a lot of people remember what he said. On the other hand, he was very concerned that writing is a replacement for deep thinking. He was concerned that writing could lead to superficial knowledge. In fact, he believed that people appeared wise but lacked true understanding. Keep that one in mind for a second. What were some other things he said about writing? He felt that writing couldn't defend itself. If someone misinterpreted the written work, you couldn't have the work come back and argue and say, no, that's not really what I meant something else. He also, of course, being a student of Socrates, believed that dialogue was more important than mere text, that discussions are interactive. We can learn by engaging in Q&A. Well, that's quite interesting, because isn't that really the same concerns we have today about AI? We're worried that people will lose the ability to think critically, they will appear wise, but in fact lack true understanding. What's even more interesting is that there's some aspects of generative AI that actually overcome the limitations with writing that Plato was so concerned about. For example, if you've got the right chatbot and you know how to use it properly, you can engage in Socratic dialogue with your chatbot buddy and actually delve very deeply into many interesting topics. And we'll see lots more of examples of that today. Let's move on another 1,800 years or so up to the 15th century with the advent of the printing press. It's often hard to believe it in this day and age where we take books and printed material for granted, but there was a time where the only way to convey knowledge at scale, using that word somewhat loosely here, was by having a stable of monks who would sit there and copy in a very tedious and often error-prone way manuscripts making wonderful, beautiful illuminations. But this was not something you could do unless you had access to lots of resources and a rich patron. So what did printing press do? It democratized knowledge sharing, increased literacy, allowed us to be able to learn from other people, even if it was mere writing. But there were also problems, even from the beginning. If you take a look in 1825, there was the famous moon hoax, where someone came up with a picture of what looked to be creatures on the moon, and it created a panic, not unlike the H.G. Wells War of the World panic, because people thought that there were creatures on the moon and they would probably come here and eat our brains and so on. So fake news could be spread more easily because we had the printing press and you didn't have to have a stable of monks trying to copy all those things by hand. Moving ahead to the 18th century, the advent of the steam engine. Clearly the harbinger for the Industrial Revolution, radically transformed transportation, manufacturing, economic growth, and yet at the same time, it required, especially at the beginning, lots of extraction and consumption of coal from the use of steam engines. And for those of you who've watched The Crown, I think it's maybe season 2, there's an episode called Act of God that talks about the London smog. And so those were the consequences of having the steam engine. So once again, pros and cons. Let's move ahead a little bit further to the 19th century, the advent of electricity. Once again, revolutionized daily life. We literally could not do this presentation without electricity. All the cell phones that we've got, we couldn't without electricity. Before my mom went to William & Mary in 1956, she lived in what was then called French Morocco. And in those days, they actually didn't have electricity most of the time. And so she actually had to read by candlelight, which probably explains why her eyesight is somewhat difficult these days. But the point is, electricity is something that we take for granted and is very important for lots of technologies. Once again, though, it also contributes to pollution, especially through the burning of fossil fuels. What's funny about this, though, is not everybody was disturbed by the use of fossil fuels. So here's an article from Vanity Fair magazine in 1861, beginning of the Civil War, where it has the grand ball given by the whales in honor of the discovery of oil wells in Pennsylvania. So they were happy about discovering oil. Let's move much further forward, 20th century, the digital revolution, computers, the internet, the web, and so on. This is actually a picture of what things looked like when I was at William & Mary when we wanted to learn what was going on in the world. We would head over to Swem Library. This is actually probably more my mom's era of being at Swem Library, but that's how we learn things. Nowadays, you can't get away from news. It's all around us. We're able to be connected and learn things. And once again, it's about democratizing knowledge. This democratization of access to information has had all kinds of fascinating and disruptive consequences. If you ever read the classic book, The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman, you'll know he talks a lot about how this ability to get information spread widely lowers the barrier to entry around the world. It allows us to tap into global people, global students, and accelerates technology transition and dissemination. But there are downsides to this. It's not all rainbows and unicorns. Of course, the ability to collect all this information can be used for many other purposes. If anybody here remembers the Information Awareness Office back in the early 2000s, which was a precursor in the government to what we're doing now all the time with things like Google and Amazon who collect data on us. There's a great quote here by another Schmidt, Eric Schmidt, who says, "We know where you are, we know where you've been." So far it's kind of like Santa Claus. We can more or less know what you're thinking about. Now it starts getting up to that creepy line where they're keeping track of what you're doing. Another big problem is what's called the digital divide. There's people who have access to technology and the internet and those who don't. And that's a problem from an economic equities point of view. Nowadays, this is getting a little better. If you have a mobile device and some means to get to a Starbucks, you can get pretty much unfettered access to the internet, which is good. We'll talk later about something called the digital chasm, which is a much bigger concern. Just like the moon hoax of 1825, the internet makes it a lot easier to spread fake news, to be able to have phishing attacks. I'm sure you have all gotten emails saying your computer is infected and you need to click on this link or call this number and we will disinfect it for you. Those are scams, and this is something that's so easily spread through the internet. So now let's move up to our most recent innovation, generative AI, or Gen AI, which is basically used to create new data or content by learning patterns from data and often generating novel outputs. Sometimes it generates really novel outputs that are hallucinations, that are meaningful and often coherent. One of the very first things I did was to generate sonnets about yourself using ChatGPT. So I generated a sonnet, and it actually knows I'm at William & Mary now, so that was kind of cool. You can also use it for drug discovery, software programming, generating art. By the way, almost every image you'll see tonight was generated by AI in the last week. And that's because they have a great new tool that just came out a week ago, and it's way better. The most important thing it does, for those of you who use this, it knows how to spell. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of this too much, large language models are trained on vast data sets of text and images and speech and various signals and structured data, and they basically learn statistical relationships and patterns between various elements, like words or pixels or notes. And sometimes people think that this means that large language models are nothing more than an auto-completion engine on steroids. But there's actually a lot more to them, and I'll show you some examples here shortly. So what is Gen AI giving us that's beneficial? First and foremost, much like the internet democratized access to information, generative AI is democratizing access to analysis and synthesis of data and learning. And this, of course, is important for us here at William & Mary. AI augmented tools make it much easier for expert knowledge to be accessible to a broader audience. I've written over 700 papers in my career, and my friends and family often ask me, "What is it you do?" And I say, "Oh, here's a link to my paper. Go read it." And they read it, and they come back and they go, "What is it you do?" Because they can't make heads or tails about what I'm talking about because it's written for an academic audience. Well, one of the great things that have come out very recently with large language models, and especially the latest ones that have come out in the last month or two, they do a wonderful job of summarizing the information and putting it to whatever level is appropriate. So if I want my parents to understand what I do, I can quickly take my obscure technical paper and boil it down to something they can understand. I was talking to Professor Dan Runfola, who apparently had given a talk like this a couple years ago and had used his newborn daughter as a prop when he was giving the talk. If you watch the video, you see that. And he was having his daughter, who's now 2 years old, listening to some of my videos on AI. She liked the videos I have that are music, like The Cure's Friday I'm in Love. But apparently, the videos I was talking about the history of AI evolution, she really found them incredibly boring. So I'm going to work very hard to see if I can get AI to generate a version of my material that will be appealing to a 2-year-old. And I suspect it'll probably do a lot better job than I would. Something else that you can do, which I've just started using very recently, is use tools like Notebook LM. If you've got a Google account, I very much recommend you check out Notebook LM. It'll take documents, scribbles on a napkin, videos that I recorded on these topics, and it'll turn them into a very informative and engaging podcast where two people will discuss whatever it is you feed as an input. I did that recently on part of the talk I'm giving right now that I'd recorded a while back, and it actually came up with insights as I listened to it that were not what I said. It taught me things about my own topic that made me learn and think about things in new ways. Something else that's exciting is that generative AI really is closing the gap between experts and novices. Now, sometimes that's really cool. So when I was teaching a class about 1.5 years ago at Vanderbilt, I really needed to learn to become much more proficient in database programming. I just never had time to learn that before. And by using what was then available as a large language model, I was able to learn enough about database programming that I could teach my students and come across as someone who was proficient and an expert, at least enough to give them the lessons and explain what was going on. So that's pretty cool when I could be able to bootstrap myself without having to go back and get a PhD or a master's degree in some topic. The scary part is when my students start to become experts way faster than I can keep up. And I think that is what is happening here very rapidly. And we should all be very concerned about this, because as the students that come in, and this will happen more and more as students are exposed in high school and they come to William & Mary, they're going to end up being bored, which is no fun because they'll be ahead of a lot of us. They're going to end up eventually asking themselves, why are we, or our parents, spending all this money to go to these great places when we could learn a lot of this and go to a community college and do it a lot cheaper? That's going to be an issue. But most importantly, we want to make sure that we're able to teach them things that will make them be effective in the careers that they do after they leave here in Williamsburg. So making sure that we're equipped to teach our students and keep ahead is a big challenge, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. One of the things that makes this so exciting is the fact that we can now have round-the-clock, low-cost mentoring, tutoring, and personalized learning at scale. And I'll give you a good example of how I leveraged this in the last year. So my son last year was a junior in high school. Now he's a senior. He's going to Boston University next year. And he was studying for the AP History and AP English exams. And I said to him, son, why don't you use ChatGPT to help you study for the AP History and English exam? And he said, oh, Dad, I can't use ChatGPT when I take the exam. That certainly won't let me do that. So what possible benefit could I have from using it to prepare for it? And I said, aha, rather than me going out and spending $30,000 for a personalized tutor, you can take all the questions you'll find online that are practice questions for the AP exams, and you can write your answers just like you do for the exam, and then you can feed it to ChatGPT or Claude or Google's Gemini and have it act as an AP history reviewer and give you very detailed feedback on how to improve your performance. And if you did that, you would undoubtedly learn and much faster. Those are the kind of things that we're doing now. Our students are leveraging this. We'll talk about this more later and how I've used it in my classes. And then finally, something else that's really exciting. I have to admit, I love my philosophy classes, but I had to grind my way through Immanuel Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. And if you really think about it, two things come to mind. First, if only Kant had had a word processor, life would have been much better. And secondly, you can boil down most of what's recorded there as do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's basically the golden rule. And I often wondered, wouldn't it be much more fun if I could engage in a discussion with Kant and ask him why he was so verbose? Well, using something called the persona pattern and today's up-to-date large language models, you can engage in these dialogues with your favorite person in history, especially people with lots of writing where they can be trained and be conversant. So you can actually talk to Thomas Jefferson and ask him about how long it took him to write the Declaration of Independence. Apparently it was 2.5 weeks, which is pretty cool. You could talk to Jane Austen. You could find out what Mr. Darcy was really like in real life. All kinds of fun things you could do. So this is a way of making learning way more interesting, way more engaging. There was a talk last week at the Mason School of Business on an AI summit, and there was the dean at the Love School of Business at Elon University, Haya Ajan, and she gave one of the most interesting talks I've seen about how to use generative AI in the classroom. The slides are online. I've heard rumors that her presentation will soon be online. If you have a chance to hear her presentation, it is masterful. So she gave lots more examples. I just kind of scratched the surface, but it was a really eye-opening conversation. Another great thing you could do with this technology, you can improve inclusion and access. If you have people who are hearing impaired, you can take things that are auditory and turn them into text automatically. If you have people who are visually impaired, you can create audio from videos or text. And you can also translate seamlessly between different languages. We have a lot of students in computer science who are from other countries. English is not their first language. So this allows them to be able to take the recordings of the lessons and then convert them automatically into their native language, perhaps to learn more effectively and more rapidly. But again, not everything is unicorn and rainbows. So generative AI can also be used for lots of other purposes. It can produce realistic looking but very misleading content, commonly known as deep fakes. Now, sometimes these deepfakes are whimsical and funny. There's a guy named Brian Monarch who has a whole bunch of deepfake videos where he takes famous scenes from movies and superimposes Arnold Schwarzenegger's face and voice and Sylvester Stallone's face and voice over top of the scenes. I assert to you, you have not lived until you've heard Arnold Schwarzenegger be Meg Ryan and Sylvester Stallone be Billy Crystal in the famous I'll Have What She's Having scene from When Harry Met Sally. It's amazing. However, not everything is whimsical. So there's lots of examples of people using deep fakes to impersonate famous politicians and others and say all kinds of misleading things. Here's an example from last election, January 2024. Joe Biden called up a bunch of voters in New Hampshire and told them, don't bother voting in the primary. Just wait until the election when your vote counts. Not really quite sure what that was supposed to mean. But apparently some people didn't go to the polls because Joe Biden told him not to. So very strange. This is going to become much more prominent and problematic. The ability to create art, music, text raises all kinds of thorny questions about intellectual property and copyright protection. Sometimes, again, it's kind of fun. So this is actually me, my sophomore year at William & Mary. And then I figured I would ask it to regenerate, AI to generate this with if Van Gogh had painted me. I thought that was pretty darn cool for something that took about 2 seconds to do. So that was just whimsical. But there's also other problems where people are generating art, for example, in the form of Picasso or pick your favorite artist. So this is becoming a really big problem, especially in the music industry. People are training models to write songs that sound like the Beatles or Taylor Swift or whatnot. There are both ethical and legal issues here. In fact, I'll note very briefly that the jury is still out as to whether these are problems or not. There's a lot of lawsuits working their way through the courts right now. What's also interesting is some countries have actually decided that copyright protection does not apply to training. So Japan has decided if they're better off to get good trained models than they are to enforce copyright protection on the intellectual property that's used for training the models. There are other countries that just don't care about that at all. We'll talk about that in a minute. What's a big concern here? So I'm on the AI Policy Initiative Committee, and whenever the topic of AI comes up, the very first thing people say is, can we see who's cheating? Can we have an AI detector that will find when people are using ChatGPT to generate their essay? The answer is no, especially if your students are clever enough to do a little bit of copy editing to avoid that. In my view, cheating is a big issue because we have the conventional ways of teaching and learning we've been doing here at William & Mary for 330 years, and they're now being pressured by new ways of teaching and learning that people heretofore didn't have to deal with. And as long as we keep trying to perpetuate the traditional ways of teaching and learning and pretend like the new ways of teaching and learning don't exist, cheating is going to be a big problem. What we need to do instead is rethink how we teach and learn so that these tools can actually be used to augment creativity, augment the learning experience, not replace it. Now, this is not going to be easy. In some areas, it's a lot easier to do than others. I'll give you some examples here in a minute. But one thing I'll mention is there's a new technology that just came out about a month ago called deep research from OpenAI. So if you're willing to spend $200 a month, you can get the deep research model. Deep research is like having a team of very talented postdocs to do your bidding on anything you care about. This is going to absolutely disrupt research, teaching, learning, lifelong learning, anything you can imagine. But what we can do with it is have our students solve problems they simply could not have solved before. So a good example in a fast-moving field like AI, nobody can keep up with the rate at which new papers are being published. It's impossible. If you spent all day long, every day, including the weekend, reading the papers on AI, by the time you finish reading them, you'd already be out of date. What this tool can do, however, is go out and it can scour the internet and find all the latest and greatest work using things like the Google PageRank algorithm to find what's popular, summarize it, and then compare and contrast it with something that you might want to do as either a researcher or an educator to show you how you're either leading the pack or falling behind. If we get our students trained on how to use these tools effectively, they will be so much broader and deeper in their knowledge instantly than they ever could have imagined had they had to go to wonderful swim library and look at the newspapers that we saw. So this is going to be quite dramatic. I'm already using it for all kinds of things, as anybody who works with me has quickly learned. Another downside, which we're also very concerned about, especially people working in knowledge-centric fields, is that generative AI is displacing workers. Now, what's interesting about this is historically automation disrupted the manufacturing job. The tricky part with this brave new world of generative AI, it is going to impact the knowledge jobs, the information-rich jobs. And there's a great quote, which you've probably heard, that says, AI won't take your job, but the person who knows AI better than you may take your job. And that's the world we live in, and that's what we have to be prepared for. And as always, the more intentional we are about this, the more likely we are to succeed. The second most popular topic that comes up in the AI policy meetings, once we've kind of dealt with the cheating issue, is, aren't we killing the planet? And there's a lot of very justified concerns here. For example, there's a lot of energy that's used to train models. There's a lot of water that's used to keep the data centers cool when you're training models. There's less water that's used and energy that's used when you're inferencing. And in fact, what's interesting is that there are new technologies like neuromorphic computing chips that are just coming out from companies like Intel that are going to be able to do the AI processing at a fraction of the energy usage and therefore less water consumption. But I think it's very important to keep things in perspective. I'm sure you're all familiar with the famous Bible verse that says, "Why are you concerned with a speck of dust in your neighbor's eye when you've got a plank in your eye?" So if we really take a more deep look at what's using electricity and water, It turns out there's a lot of other things that we just can't seem to do without. Aviation, e-commerce, streaming, food delivery, Uber Eats, cloud gaming for people who have kids or if you like to play games. These are actually consuming way, way more energy and water than the speck of dust that is the AI consumption. There's a nice article here which you can take a look at if you take a look at the slides and click on this link. And here are a couple things that it's worth keeping in perspective. So if you take a look at the number of American households worth of energy used every day for common computing-related tasks, you will see that lots of people watching YouTube, no real surprise there. Lots of people binge watching Netflix, no surprise there. Kids listening to Spotify, Zoom calls, people playing Fortnite. ChatGPT is way down in the mix in terms of consuming energy. If you look at water usage, it's even more interesting. A 10-minute 4K video uses quite a bit of water. A 1-hour Zoom call consumes a lot of water. At least we're not having to fly around as much, so that's good. Uploading a gigabyte file to cloud storage, browsing social media, listening to streaming music, and then finally asking ChatGPT a question. It's almost rounding error. But my favorite example here is water consumed by ChatGPT versus other things. So if you really want to save the planet, fix the leaky pipes. So way more water consumed for that. And for God's sake, don't eat a hamburger. Keeping those cows hydrated is far more consumptive of water than asking ChatGPT 30 questions or even watching some TV in your home. So just keep those things in perspective. That, by the way, does not mean that AI is off the hook. It just means that we have a lot of other things to solve before we go after that to make a difference. So why is generative AI different from all the other disruptive technologies we talked about? I'm going to give you just 4 reasons. There's lots more. Unprecedented rate of adoption and evolution, automation of creativity at scale, democratization of skills, and augmentation of human capabilities. These are some of the reasons people are so worried about AI. Is AI the end of humanity? Is AI the end of education? Are we going to be doomed? And so on and so forth. If you want to do some doom scrolling, type into your browser, is AI the end of the world? And you will find no end of articles talking about how it's really the end of the world. So let's talk about the unprecedented rate of adoption and evolution. It turns out that within the first 2 months, ChatGPT had 100 million plus users. It was the fastest adoption of technology in internet history. There are now other large language models in widespread use, including one called DeepSeek that I just want to pause on just for a second. If you're not aware, DeepSeek is a large language model that came out of People's Republic of China. It came out about 2 months ago. Totally caused the stock market to tank, caused people to say we no longer have to buy NVIDIA, and it did a lot of other disruptions to our economy. The reason why it was disruptive was the Chinese who created this claimed they were able to create a very capable model much faster and much cheaper than what we were doing here in the United States. Here's a question for you. I'm going to ask a rhetorical question. What if one of the reasons why DeepSeek was so good was that they trained it on copyrighted information? And we're kind of not supposed to do that here. What if another reason that DeepSeek was so good was that they trained it on personally identifiable information, like health records of every person in China? What if they trained it on trade secret or top secret information that was exfiltrated from Western companies and countries and people? What if that's the world we live in now? They're giving it away for free. The whole point is to disrupt the United States economic model in technology. A good question for us to think about here at William & Mary with our 360-degree view of liberal arts and technology is, what do we do in a world where people aren't playing by the rules, yet we have to compete as if it's a level playing field? That's a very, very interesting ethical and political and social question, and we're just beginning to wrestle with that. And of course, the point of this is a very intentional plan by the People's Republic of China to come after our lead in artificial intelligence technology. And they're moving really fast. Another thing that's quite fascinating is the barrier to entry is low and the ability to do innovative stuff in AI is very decentralized. Unlike cloud computing, where you can be Google or Amazon or Microsoft, and that's about it. There are not many other players because you have to have a lot of resources. Aside from training models, you can have all kinds of innovation using AI. And that's really good for us here at William & Mary because we don't need to go out and buy huge amounts of data centers in order to do this. We can start to innovate very quickly and rapidly and make a difference very fast. So I think it's actually good from the point of view of being a fast follower or even a first mover in some areas, which I'll talk about in a second. One of the other things that's very different about generative AI from all the other things that came before is it causes us to ask the fundamental question, what does it mean to be a human being? If you think about science fiction, we've been talking about this for a long time. We've been talking about the Terminator, where Skynet becomes self-aware. We have HAL, we have Roy Batty from Blade Runner. We've got Commander Data from Star Trek. We've got the Vision from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And these have all wrestled with this question of what's a human, what's not a human. Was it immoral for Dave to pull the memory units out of Hal as it sang the Daisy song? Was that immoral? Was it actually killing a sentient creature? That's a good question. The earlier technologies mostly either enhanced physical capabilities, such as steam engines and electricities, or communication capabilities, like writing, the printing press, and the internet and web. But it didn't really ask, what did it mean to be human? What's really fascinating about the new generation of AI is how quickly it's been able to mimic and in many cases surpass what humans are able to do with respect to music, art, writing, videos, code. I'm a big fan of the Beatles, and you're probably aware that about a year ago or so, they had the first new Beatles song in decades come out called Now and Then. And they managed to do this by using AI technology to take a cassette tape that Yoko Ono had given to Paul McCartney of John Lennon playing a piano and singing a song, and they were able to somehow extract his voice from that and turn it into a new song. Really would have been impossible to do without that technology. There are so many other examples. Computer programming is a great one, making movies, videos, and so on. And what's happening here is we're now able to automate tasks that traditionally needed people to be creative and innovative, and it's allowing us to be able to do this at scale. Another important issue is democratization of computational thinking. I think it's been pretty clear for at least the past 5 or 6 years, maybe longer for some people, that almost every discipline can benefit from computational thinking. The ability to think about things logically, to assess, to look for patterns in data, patterns in other artifacts, automate where possible, generalize from small facts into bigger picture views. Up to this point, if you wanted to do computational thinking, you had to learn to program. When I was a professor at Vanderbilt, we would have people come from chemistry and biology and divinity and say, I want to use computational thinking in my field. Can you help us? And we say, you bet. We're going to teach you Python. We're going to teach you Ruby or JavaScript. That's not really what they wanted to do. They didn't want to learn to be a programmer. And the reason why they didn't want to learn to be a programmer is that programming requires you to wrestle with all kinds of accidental complexities that have nothing whatsoever to do with the domain problem you're solving. It has to do with mastering syntax, memory management, concurrency control, buffer overflow problems, and so on and so forth. And those things are distractions from actually solving the domain problem that people really care about. What's happened in the last couple of years is there's a whole new discipline called prompt engineering, which basically involves structured interactions that we do using natural language to tell the large language model to do our bidding. And if you become good at prompt engineering, which is surprisingly not that hard to do, you can get tremendous amount of value out of these tools. In fact, way more value than you can get if you don't know how to do that. And that should really come as no surprise. If you talk to your human friends and you ask ill-formed, vague questions, you wouldn't be surprised to get strange responses. Same thing is true with a large language model. If you don't ask the questions well, you should not be surprised when your answers don't come back. Prompt engineering and the ability to use natural language to interact with technology is radically lowering the barrier to entry for all kinds of creative and technical things. And if you're willing to spend $20 a month, which is about 3 cups of pumpkin spice latte at Starbucks, they're about $6.50 to $7 a piece. If you have that spare change, you can get the ChatGPT Plus program, and I think similar things for Anthropic, Claude, and so on. So for a very little amount of money, you can get access to much better tools. That investment, coupled with prompt engineering and a few other tricks of the trade, will make you extremely effective at being able to do this technology. This kind of ability is very important for people who are not computer professionals. Computer professionals have other ways of solving the problem through programming, the traditional way, but everybody who can think in a structured, clear, logical way can leverage this. That is the students we're producing at William & Mary. They can all think in a structured, clear way. So this is very powerful, and there's lots of other examples on my website of videos that talk about how to do this. What's also nice about this is heretofore, if you wanted to be able to do analysis at scale, you typically had to have a research group in your company or organization that would do that work for you. It was very hard as an individual, as a proprietor, as a small business owner to be able to get access to this technology. If you take a look at the massive open online courses from Coursera and you Google for Jules White, who was my colleague at Vanderbilt, he has about a dozen courses on how to become an expert at prompt engineering. And he was joined by a CEO of a design company in town named Bob Higgins, who gives a wonderful course on generative AI for leaders. And he talks about how as a CEO, he often has to make decisions without a lot of people to bounce ideas off of for various reasons. And so he uses ChatGPT as his thought partner to come up with better solutions. This is something that we can all do without really breaking a sweat. The last piece of the puzzle here is augmentation of human capabilities. So I really don't like to use the word artificial intelligence. I think it gives the wrong message. I prefer augmented intelligence. And this is really about amplifying, not replacing or supplanting human creativity and problem solving by assisting people to do a bigger job, do harder jobs that heretofore would have required a tremendous amount of creative thought of a human by themselves. And there's lots and lots of examples of this. I will give you 3 short examples and then walk through a little case study here in a second. I've been applying this to the courses I teach for some time now, ever since I got access to ChatGPT in the fall of 2022. There's certain things I love to do as a teacher. I love to create colorful lecture slides. I love to come up with ways to explain complex concepts so people can learn and enjoy them. Other stuff I don't really like to do. There's certain things I find boring. For example, if I give a lecture and I record the lecture, I am usually hard-pressed to figure out what I talked about for the past hour. So what I do is I upload everything in little chunks, because most students today have a memory attention span of between 5 to 7 minutes. So all my lectures are 5 to 7 minutes long in lots of chunks. And so I upload them to YouTube, and I use a plugin for Chrome called GLASP, G-L-A-S-P. And what it'll do is if you have a video that you've uploaded, you click on the little GLASP icon, which is the ChatGPT logo, and it will take a transcript of your video, throw it into ChatGPT, and then I say, please write a 150-word summary of my video using first-person voice. And it spits out a wonderful summary. I then turn around and edit it just to make sure it didn't hallucinate. And very quickly, I can produce lots of summaries of my work without having to remember what I talked about for the past hour. Something else I do, which is a variant on this, I use these tools to create exams from my lecture material. That way, guaranteeing that the things I'm teaching my students are what they're tested on. You don't have to go, Professor Schmidt, you didn't talk about XYZ, because I used an exam from 3 years ago that I forgot to update. This is really cool because, number one, I can create really interesting quiz questions. But more importantly, my students can use my videos and other material, like my slides and my handouts, to create study guides so they can go and learn what I'm doing. And it's just been wonderful because they can now go off and use that persona pattern I talked about before, where they can ask themselves questions based on my material, and then they can answer the questions, and ChatGPT will give them feedback on how well they answer the questions based on what I presented in the lecture. So it's a really easy way to incentivize the students to pay attention to what I've done. But my favorite example, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail, is I've taught generative AI to help me grade my programming assignment. And I'm going to spend some time explaining why that was important. And when I talk about this, which I'll talk about in more detail in my little case study coming up, think about all the other things we do that involve writing to demonstrate proficiency. So I will assert to you that any class where the written artifact is used to determine who knows what they're doing and who doesn't can benefit from what I'm about to talk about. Also be aware that any class where writing is the means for demonstrating proficiency is under grave attack from generative AI. If the essay, the book report, the final report, a computer program, those are the places where we should be most concerned because it's all too tempting to do more than use these tools as a way to check your knowledge and use it to create the answer. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So I titled this, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bot, for those of you who are Dr. Strangelove fans. So here was the issue. It turns out that in the computer programming field, generative AI can trivially generate very accurate solutions to programming assignments that have detailed specifications, which is the way we typically teach our introductory programming courses. So when I was at Vanderbilt about a year and a half ago, we had an offsite with the faculty, and one of my favorite professors of the practice, he's a teaching faculty, Jerry, he came up and said, I've been doing this really cool programming assignment. They're going to program basically a music writing program. This is the hardest program. This takes people a month and a half to do it so hard. I said, oh, Jerry, I've just been playing with ChatGPT. Let's see how it works. So we sat down together and I said, give me the spec, the thing that describes to the students what to do. And he said, this is hard. There's no way it's going to do. Well, we sat down and in about 10 minutes, it had gone through a specification and clearly was generating perfect solution. And I could see Jerry's face was getting ashened, and when it was all done, I was like, Jerry, this is so cool. Isn't this the most exciting thing you've ever seen? And he said, Doug, it's time for me to retire. Wasn't quite the answer I was looking for, but probably an honest way. That was the day before classes started in the fall semester of 2023. And I thought to myself, I teach the upper division courses. These are hard classes. There's no way ChatGPT could solve my assignment. But it was the night before my first assignment was going to go out. So I went back and said, well, just for fun, I'll see what it can do. Well, of course, it took my specification and generated a perfect solution in about 2 seconds. And then it was a problem, right? When it was Jerry's class, not my problem. Now it was my problem. Now, the great thing about this was ChatGPT taketh away and ChatGPT giveth. So what I did is I said, ChatGPT, how can I change my assignments so you can't generate the solutions? And so what it told me, which I kind of knew, but it helped reinforce that, make your specifications more general. Don't give people as much of a hint. Make it more open-ended. However, that solved one problem, but it created a new problem. And the new problem was, up to that point, I had been using very sophisticated unit tests without getting too much into computer science stuff. These were tests that would take a look at the programs my students wrote and would check to see if they conformed to a particular rubric. So imagine if you were grading an essay, you might have something very similar. You'd have a rubric and have people who would take a look at that. Well, the problem was, by generalizing the requirements, my unit test could no longer look for very specific things because people had a broader range of options, and my old way of testing was deficient. So that was a problem. There's another problem. The other way to solve this problem is to go out and hire an army of graders and TAs, give them the rubric, pay them with pizza and Diet Coke and so on, and have them do the assessment. That has another problem. The problem is what we refer to as the inter-rater reliability problem. For anybody who ever watched 1970s era gymnastics, you remember that problem, right? Soviet judge scores the Soviet gymnasts high, or high skaters or whatnot. US judge scores them low, and vice versa. So this is a problem with graders. Some graders are easy, some graders are hard. And if you give people a lot of things to grade, eventually their brains just turn into mush, and they do a very poor job of grading. The key lesson that I learned from this is, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. I couldn't use the very sophisticated unit tests to do the grading. I couldn't rely on an army of graders. I had to come up with something new. And so this turned out to be what I did. I used augmented intelligence to help automate assessing. So my way of teaching is sort of unusual. I have students submit an assignment. I then go through and review every assignment manually. And I write a list of all the mistakes that they're making. And then I give them something which we'll talk about in a second called the frequently made mistakes video. And then they have to go back and revise their programs based on my feedback. And then they submit those, and then the graders and the TAs finally grade them for the final grade. If they play their cards right and they're willing to put effort in, they should all get a perfect score. What I did was I used ChatGPT to automate some of the key steps in here so that they could help to review the student solutions. Now again, think about outside the world of programming. Think about reading essays if you're an English professor or a philosophy professor. Similar idea. What I would do before, I would look at all the programs. I would write in a big file with all the things I saw that were problems. And I called that the frequently made mistakes file. And then I would make a video of the frequently made mistakes, and my students could then watch that video. But the problem was, every semester I had to do this over and over again, and so it took a long time. Moreover, my graders would have to read my mind, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So what I did, now I write down the frequently made mistakes list in a file, and then we automatically turn it into a rubric that ChatGPT can use to check whether updated student programs conform to the things I found as being problems. And it can do this all relatively automatically. What is nice about this is we don't get rid of the graders. So we didn't fire all the graders and TAs, but we kind of flip the script on them. Rather than having them have to read through every student's assignment, the updated assignment, and see if they addressed all the comments I made, instead we have ChatGPT go through the assignments and look at the updates. And then it spits out a very detailed analysis of what they did or didn't do. And then the TAs and graders look at that and see if it was going off the rails. So they don't have to read my mind anymore in order to figure out how to grade the assessments. And I can do a much better job, a much more thorough job, because I've automated it. We actually wrote a paper that just got accepted to a conference recently that talked about this as a method. I am so enthusiastic about it because it made what was otherwise very tedious and error-prone work that was drudgery for me and the graders into something that was really easy and fun. And the other thing that was great about this was there was almost no chance for false positives. If generative AI, if ChatGPT didn't quite catch things correctly and it scored the students down a bit, then either the graders would find it when they did their review, or I guarantee you the students will find it when we give them back their assignment and they lose points for something that was actually not a mistake. So this is a great example of, if you play your cards right, you drive down the probability or the consequence of error to almost nil. Students may not pay attention to my comments, but they do pay attention to their grade. What I learned from this experience was that augmented intelligence is most effective when used to iteratively improve accuracy. So there would be times when ChatGPT wouldn't quite catch the mistake I was trying to get it to find. This is where things got really interesting. With almost any other tool, if you use the tool and you get back a result you don't understand, you're just kind of stuck. With ChatGPT, when it couldn't recognize something I knew was a problem, I would go and say, please tell me how I can write a prompt that will have you find that mistake next time. And it would come back and say, oh, if you rephrase the prompt as XYZ, now I'll be able to find it. So you could actually literally engage in Socratic dialogue with the tool you're using for grading, and then use the results to make you better at making it do what you wanted it to do. Good luck trying to do this with almost any other tool. It's next to impossible. So this is a great example of being able to augment human intelligence, not replace it. It augments it. So I could do a much more thorough job of giving my students the feedback that they richly deserved without spending all of my life doing nothing but grading programs. And think about the number of places here at William & Mary where we grade things. And we're very proud, as we should be, about giving students the personalized touch. But if you have a large class, there just aren't enough hours in the day to do all the other things you want to spend your time doing. Most people don't want to spend all their time grading papers. They'd like to spend their time coming up with creative new assignments or creative new lectures or meeting with the students and finding out what they're doing. So I think there are lots of valuable things we can do by augmenting ourselves. So the last piece of my talk is human-centered augmented intelligence at William & Mary. What is human-centered augmented intelligence, or AI++, and how does it differ from just plain old augmented intelligence? In my mind, augmented intelligence is really about making people more productive by having an exoskeleton for your brain by using ChatGPT or your favorite LLM. Human-centered augmented intelligence is really about creating and applying technologies that enhance human cognition and decision-making while keeping us firmly in control and central to the process in a deeper way. It's really about including all the other disciplines beyond just the technical side in order to do things in a much richer way. So it's powered by intellect, guided by humanity. This was the diagram that ChatGPT and I came up with to demonstrate what this might look like. So we've got STEM and technology fields on one side, and social sciences, of course. And then we have the humanities and ethics and law and stuff on the other side. And it's really bringing those two things together that make a difference. And once again, when I think about it, these were exactly the same lessons that my teachers taught me here 40 plus years ago. Have a justified true belief. Don't just take people's opinion that something is good or bad. Actually have some reasoning behind it. When I was the director of operational test and evaluation at the Pentagon, I had a big sign on my door that said, nullus in verba, which basically means don't take anybody's word for it. Verify and then trust if the verification works out. So once again, justified true belief, open-minded skepticism, get your hands dirty, figure out what works and what doesn't. Don't just live off of a ragtag bunch of out-of-date opinions based on the first version of ChatGPT. And then, of course, transcend dualism. Look for synergies, look for synthesis, look for ways of getting both and. AI is neither good nor bad. Technology is neither good nor bad. Liberal arts is neither good nor bad. It's the combination that makes the difference. A lot of other places are going to jump with irrational exuberance into embracing AI without thinking carefully about some of the dangers that lurk beneath the surface. Likewise, some places are going to pretend like this isn't happening and hiding their head in the sand. That's not the William & Mary way. We're not going to uncritically accept something at face value, but hopefully we're also not going to dismiss things when the evidence is increasingly stacking up that this is really something transformational. So what are some things that we might actually do if we want to be preeminent at human-centered augmented intelligence? And I think it really comes down to emphasizing learning, innovation, impact, and ethics. What can we do with respect to learning? I think we need to work together to have groundbreaking curricula that blends things that we historically have thought of in different silos. Machine learning combined with cognitive science and neuroscience. Having AI and data ethics combined with historical perspectives on technology evolution. How did we get to this point? What were things before? How did people used to think about these issues before AI and data science took over? What's the impact of augmented intelligence in some of our really interesting programs like the Global Scholars Program that's looking at global policy analysis? I absolutely guarantee to you that people in the People's Republic of China today are building predictive models that are modeling the way in which individuals and organizations in the West are going to react when the PRC does provocative things culturally, economically, and militarily. And if you ever ask yourself the question, why are they sucking up all this data through TikTok? Why are they sucking up all this data for DeepSeek? It's for those reasons. We have a long and proud tradition of creating policy people at William & Mary. They have the right skills to be effective in the types of policy we've been doing for the last 70 years during the Cold War. In the brave new world of tomorrow, where our near-peer competitors is part of the great powers competition, we're going to have people who know how to use technology to stay one step ahead. Because those folks are not slowing down. They're moving fast with deliberate speed to upend the world order. Something else that we need to do here is have next-generation computational research hubs where we have access for faculty and students to cutting-edge neuromorphic chips. These are the things that are used to reduce the power consumption necessary to do AI computations and inferencing. Quantum computing, which at some point will hopefully come along and be real. That's really the intersection of quantum mechanics, which is a physics thing, with quantum information systems, which is a computer science, data science thing. Having resources like that would be invaluable to keep people here at all levels at the cutting edge. Being able to have multimedia frameworks that allow us to work with tech, voice, video, art, music, combine those things together in novel ways. The graphic arts domain, people doing gaming, people doing storyboards for movies and things. It's very transformational, and we need to be at the forefront of that. AI impact labs. We need to find ways to allow interdisciplinary teams of students with some faculty help, for example, through the Entrepreneurship Hub, to be able to tackle real-world challenges, reimagining urban infrastructure, optimizing healthcare delivery, enhancing agentic cybersecurity defense, strengthening coastal resilience, being able to look at these things and model them effectively and get groups of people, students especially, to work together to both solve shorter-term problems as well as help to inform investments for longer-term research strategies. And then finally, something I would be remiss if I didn't focus on would be an AI ethics institute, where we can equip policymakers and leaders with the framework and the tools that are necessary to shape and guide responsible innovation with AI, being able to do things in a principled, adaptive, transparent, and trustworthy way. These are not going to be easy. As I mentioned before, there's wicked problems we have to deal with in terms of global power competition in the world. And we have to be prepared to not turn ethics into a suicide pact economically and culturally. And then, of course, something else that's very important and on a lot of people's minds these days especially, be able to find ways of safeguarding economic dynamism and being able to ensure we have good partnerships between government and corporations with respect to regulation of these various technologies. We talked earlier about the digital divide, which was the separation between people who had access to the internet and computing and those who didn't. I think we're about to hit the digital chasm, which is much bigger than the digital divide. And that's going to be between people who are savvy in the creation and use of AI technologies and those who are not, either because they can't or they won't. And this is going to happen very, very quickly. That's why I'm excited to be back here at this pivotal time in William & Mary's history to help make sure that we can move forward being risk prudent with deliberate speed, but making the changes that we need to make sure we don't fall behind or our students don't fall behind. Here's the good news. There's almost nobody on the planet who has more than about 24 months or so of expertise with these technologies. One of the things that became very popular in the past decade or so in the computing field was this idea of a boot camp. So the boot camp is where you take people who got a sociology degree, and who goes, what am I going to do with my sociology degree? I'll come back and become a web developer. So within about 24 weeks, you can learn how to become a web developer, which is great. There's a problem. When you get out into the world of web developers, there's a lot of people out there with decades of experience with web development, and you're now competing against them, and about the only way to differentiate yourself is through your price. So you have to price yourself lower than the competition. That's making yourself into a commodity. What's great about generative AI, and this is sort of a once-in-a-lifetime experience, it's a completely flat playing field. Nobody has more than 24 months. Maybe Sam Altman or someone like that, but that's about it. So it's easy to get involved. You don't have to become a PhD in computer science. You don't have to become a nuclear physics PhD. You can become extremely proficient by spending $20 to $200 a month to get access to the large language models, embracing and learning prompt engineering and a few other tricks and best practices of the field. Our students are doing it now. It's remarkable, people coming in out of high school who've taught themselves quite a bit of things very quickly in a short time, and they're now actually pushing the boundaries of what's possible to do. And this is going to be a real issue in our intro courses, because we're going to have people with wildly different experience levels. Now is a good time for William & Mary to become preeminent in human-centered augmented intelligence. There may be some people who say, this is an untested technology. It's like trying to give experimental drugs to our students who are guinea pigs. Do we want our students to be guinea pigs for these experimental drugs? And I'll just remind people a couple things. William & Mary is not just the birthplace of democracy. It's also a place that started a revolution. And imagine what would have happened if Thomas Jefferson or James Madison or other founders of the country had said, this democracy thing seems a little risky. Let's wait for the French to have that revolution in 1789 and just see what happens. No, they thought deeply. They studied the classics, they studied John Locke, they were courageous enough to be decisive, and they took the steps that gave birth to our nation. We can do the same thing here and have the same output, but I think we're in a really good position to make a difference. And so I hope you'll join me as we move forward in this with open-minded skepticism, looking for justifications and reason, and find ways to transcend those dualisms, just like the professors I learned from here so many years ago. So thank you very much.